September 1683, the city of Vienna groaned under the weight of fear. Its walls shook with the thunder of Ottoman cannons, each blast sending stone and dust into the air like a death knell. Inside, just over 11,000 defenders fought to stay alive. Hunger hollowed their faces, exhaustion dragged at their limbs. The once proud capital of the Habsburgs had become a prison of desperation. Beyond those walls stretched an army of 150,000 Ottomans, a force so vast it seemed to cover the earth itself. Camps, banners and siege lines stretched endlessly across the fields. To the besiegers, Vienna was not just another conquest, it was the final key. If the city fell, the gates of Europe would swing wide open. Rome, Paris and perhaps even London could be next. This was not merely a siege of stone and mortar, it was a siege of civilizations. To the defenders, surrender meant not only death, but the erasure of everything they knew: faith, culture, memory. To the Ottomans, victory meant glory eternal, and the expansion of their empire's shadow across Christendom. And yet, what seemed inevitable would soon collapse into the unthinkable. Against this tide of overwhelming power, only 80,000 Crusaders, Poles, Austrians, and Germans would ride into the storm, outnumbered nearly 2 to 1. Their mission was madness itself. But in that madness, history found its turning point, for within days, the greatest empire of the age would suffer a humiliation so deep it marked the beginning of its decline. This is the story of the Battle of Vienna, where the fate of a continent balanced on the edge of a sword, a story of courage, arrogance, betrayal, and a charge so thunderous it shook the very earth. And before we begin, ask yourself, if stories like this are left untold, what else have we already lost to silence? If these forgotten truths fade from memory, then the sacrifices of those who fought here, who bled and died in shadows of walls and fields, will have been for nothing. Don't let that happen. Subscribe now, because without you, history disappears, and their voices vanish forever. The Ottoman army that surrounded Vienna in 1683 was no ordinary force. Under the command of Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha, it represented the empire at the very height of its power. For decades, the Ottomans had been Europe's nightmare, their janissaries disciplined, fearless, and merciless, sweeping across the Balkans and pressing deeper into Central Europe. Kara Mustafa marched not as a conqueror hungry for territory alone, but as a man intoxicated by glory, dreaming of carving his name into eternity. He wanted Vienna, not simply because it was the capital of the Habsburgs, but because it was a symbol. Take Vienna, and the road to the heart of Europe lay open. Take Vienna, and the Ottoman crescent might one day rise above St. Peter's Basilica in Rome itself. And so he brought with him one of the largest armies Europe had ever seen, an ocean of soldiers stretching across fields, its camps bristling with tents, its cannons mounted in endless rows. Siege engineers dug deep tunnels beneath the city, trying to collapse its walls. Heavy artillery pounded the defenses night and day, reducing stone towers to rubble. Food supplies within the city dwindled rapidly. Rats and vermin became meals of desperation. The defenders rationed bread until loaves turned to crumbs, while children cried in hunger. Priests led desperate prayers in cathedrals that shook with each Ottoman cannon blast, their voices echoing against the crumbling walls. Still the Ottomans pressed harder, certain the end was near. To Kara Mustafa, Vienna was already his prize. He only needed to reach out and take it. But far beyond the besieged city, a fragile hope stirred. A call for aid had gone out across Europe, and in response, a coalition formed, not out of love, but out of fear. Leading them was Poland's King Jan III, Sobieski, a man as much a warrior as he was a monarch. Sobieski knew what was at stake. If Vienna fell, Poland itself would eventually be next. Yet the alliance he commanded was tenuous at best. German princes, Austrian nobles, and the Holy Roman Emperor had little trust in one another. Old rivalries lingered, and suspicion ran deep. But for once, survival demanded unity. Together these forces marched toward Vienna, 80,000 strong, facing a journey across treacherous terrain, thick forests, muddy roads, and hostile villages that offered little food or shelter. Every mile was a reminder of their impossible odds. They knew the numbers. The Ottomans outnumbered them nearly 2-1. The enemy was entrenched, their fortifications prepared, their morale soaring. To ride into such a storm was to ride toward death itself, and yet they marched, not for glory, not for riches, but because if Vienna fell, all of Europe might fall with it. Every man in Sobieski's ranks carried this burden, the knowledge that the survival of Christendom might depend on their courage alone. And here, a question rises for us, as much as for them. Would you march towards certain death to save strangers? Could you face the might of an empire when your odds of survival were slim at best? Or would you turn away, leaving the city to burn, and history to take its course without you? The 12th of September dawned with fire. As the sun rose over Vienna, the city's defenders braced themselves for what they feared would be their final day. Ottoman cannons unleashed their fury in a relentless bombardment. Clouds of smoke and dust cloaked the sky, while sappers tunneled beneath the walls, planting explosives meant to shatter the last defenses. From the ramparts, exhausted soldiers watched as wave after wave of Ottoman infantry advanced, ladders slamming against broken stone, arrows and musket balls filling the air. The defenders, though starved and weary, fought back with grim determination. Muskets cracked, pikes thrust, boiling pitch and stones rained down upon the enemy, but the sheer numbers of the Ottoman host seemed endless. The city trembled under the assault, and priests moved among the terrified, offering last rites to men who expected never to see another dawn. Yet, as all appeared lost, the distant hills stirred with movement. Dust rose upon the ridgelines. The glint of steel caught the sun. The Crusader army had arrived. 80,000 men, hardened by weeks of brutal marching, had finally come within sight of Vienna. Their banners rose in the wind, a patchwork of nations reluctantly bound together by desperation. To the defenders, it was salvation made flesh. To Kara Mustafa, however, it looked like a bluff, a nuisance rather than a threat. He believed his army too strong, his position too secure. He dismissed the coalition as too late, too fractured, too weak to stand against his might. In his arrogance, he failed to see that the tide of history was already turning. By noon, the Crusaders began their assault. They advanced cautiously at first, testing the Ottoman lines, probing their defenses. The battle spread across hills and valleys, a brutal clash of steel, smoke and blood. For hours the coalition forces ground forward, pressing the Ottomans back inch by inch. Yet the true storm had not yet begun. As the afternoon waned, King Jan III Sobieski unleashed the move that would carve his name into legend. With a thunderous command, he ordered the largest cavalry charge in recorded history. 20,000 horsemen, surging forward in a tidal wave of iron and flesh. At the center rode the Polish Winged Hussars, their armor gleaming, great wooden wings strapped to their backs, tipped with feathers that screamed as they cut through the air. To the Ottomans, it was as if the sky itself had opened, and angels of death had descended. The earth shook beneath the weight of hooves. The air split with the roar of men and horses united in a single, unstoppable strike. Banners flew high, lances leveled, sabers drawn. When the charge struck, it hit like a hammer upon glass. The Ottoman lines buckled. Panic rippled through the ranks. Soldiers who had once thought themselves invincible broke and ran as the Crusader cavalry tore into them with ruthless force. What had begun as a siege of conquest dissolved into chaos and slaughter. Within mere hours, an army that had seemed destined to claim Europe was shattered beyond repair. Kara Mustafa himself fled the battlefield in disgrace, his dream of glory reduced to ashes in the dust of Vienna's fields. The sun set not on a triumphant empire, but on the broken shadow of one. This was the moment that decided the fate of Europe. One charge, one thunderous, unimaginable act of defiance, turned despair into deliverance, defeat into victory. And yet, think on this. What if Sobieski had hesitated? What if the coalition had fractured before reaching Vienna? What if Those 20,000 horsemen had never ridden down the slopes, the map of Europe, the faith of nations. The very stories we tell today might be unrecognizable. If you had stood on that hill staring down a sea of soldiers twice your number, would you have charged with Sobieski or stayed back in fear? Before you answer, remember this. If you walk away from this story without sharing it, without preserving it, then you're doing exactly what Kara Mustafa hoped history would do. Let courage be forgotten. Let sacrifice vanish. Don't be the reason their voices are lost. Comment your answer below and subscribe now, because if you don't, these truths die here, and silence will finish the victory. The Ottomans never won. When the dust settled on the fields outside Vienna, the unthinkable had happened. The greatest army of the Ottoman Empire, 150,000 strong, had been broken and scattered by a coalition that was half its size. The siege was lifted for the defenders who had clung to life behind the crumbling walls. The sight of fleeing Ottoman banners felt like salvation itself. Starving citizens poured into the streets, their voices rising in hymns of gratitude as church bells rang across the battered city. Vienna, a city that had teetered on the edge of annihilation, breathed again. But this victory was more than local relief. It shattered the illusion of Ottoman invincibility that had loomed over Europe for centuries. For generations, the empire had seemed unstoppable, its borders expanding relentlessly, its armies feared from Persia to the gates of Europe. Yet in a single day, at the height of their confidence, they had been humbled. The myth of inevitability cracked, and with it the tide of Ottoman expansion permanently halted. What had once seemed destined, the crescent rising over Western Europe, vanished like smoke in the evening sky. But triumph always demands a price. Kara Mustafa, who had led the siege with dreams of eternal glory, returned to Istanbul not as a hero, but as a scapegoat. The Sultan, furious over the disaster, ordered his execution. The man who had commanded one of the greatest armies in history was strangled with a silk cord, a death as quiet as his ambitions had once been loud. Meanwhile, across Europe, celebrations erupted. King Jan Sobieski was hailed as the savior of Christendom, the rider who had turned the tide with the greatest cavalry charge the world had ever seen. And yet, in time, his name faded from common memory. His sacrifice, his gamble, and his victory too often lie buried beneath dust and dates, recalled only in passing, while lesser figures sometimes claim greater fame. That, perhaps, is the cruelest twist of history, that those who give everything are not always remembered by those who inherit the fruits of their struggle. Vienna lived, Europe endured, but the men who carried that burden, many never came home. They rest in unmarked graves, their courage echoing only faintly across centuries. And now the question falls to us: will their voices fade completely, or will we carry them forward? You cannot hear this story and walk away to know of starving families holding the walls, of priests blessing soldiers who expected to die, of men who charged headlong into a storm of death and somehow turned despair into deliverance, and then do nothing, is to let their sacrifice die a second death. History doesn't vanish on its own. It vanishes because people stop telling it, stop sharing it, stop caring enough to keep it alive. And if you let that happen, then Kara Mustafa, in a sense, wins. The silence becomes his victory. Don't let that be the end. Like, share and subscribe. Not for this channel, but for the memory of those who stood when everything seemed lost. Because if you turn away, their story ends here, and the courage of Vienna is swallowed by silence forever. History often turns, not on numbers, not on the size of an army or the strength of its walls, but on something far more fragile. Courage. At Vienna, 80,000 men rode into a storm. They had no right to survive, outnumbered, exhausted, divided by language and suspicion. They should have failed. But courage is not always rational. It is not about knowing you can win. It is about refusing to surrender when the world insists you must. In 1683, that courage reshaped the destiny of Europe. Without it, Vienna would have fallen, and with it, perhaps all of Christendom. Sometimes the hinge of history is small, but the door it swings open is vast. Another lesson whispers from the battlefield. Unity is power. The soldiers who gathered under Sobieski's command came from different lands, spoke different tongues, and bore different banners. Poles, Austrians, Germans, nations that had fought one another before, and would again. Yet, for a fleeting moment, they stood together, because the alternative was death. And in that unity, they found strength enough to defy the greatest empire of their age. The irony, of course, is that unity often arrives only when survival demands it. How different would our world look if such unity were embraced before the walls began to crumble? And then there is the shadow of arrogance. Kara Mustafa marched with supreme confidence, convinced his victory was inevitable. He dismissed warnings, underestimated his enemies, and indulged his own pride. In the end, it was not just the Polish cavalry that destroyed him, but his own hubris. History repeats this lesson relentlessly. Greed and arrogance topple the mighty. As surely as swords and cannons, empires rise not only on strength, but on wisdom. And when wisdom is lost, even the strongest fall. But Vienna is not only a story of the past, its echoes reach us still, even today, in our personal lives, in our politics, in our societies. The odds can feel overwhelming. We face struggles that seem too great, divisions that seem too deep, and challenges that seem impossible to overcome. Yet Vienna teaches us that unity can turn despair into deliverance, and courage can topple giants. When arrogance and greed promise easy victory, they often sow the seeds of downfall. Instead, the thunder of hooves in 1683 still whispers today, reminding us that even in the darkest hour, salvation can come with the dawn. But here lies the danger. If you hear that whisper and do nothing, it fades. The lesson dies. The courage of Vienna becomes nothing more than a line in a dusty book, forgotten by the very people it was meant to guide. And when we forget, we are doomed to stumble into the same arrogance, the same divisions, the same despair. Do not let silence erase what blood once possessed. Subscribe, share, and keep this story alive, because if you don't, then you are letting their sacrifice dissolve into nothing, and the thunder of 1683 dies with you. Vienna was saved. Europe survived. And from that September day, in 1683, the Ottomans began a slow and irreversible decline. The empire that had once seemed unstoppable would never again march so confidently into the heart of the continent. The thunder of hooves and the clash of steel on those fields outside Vienna marked more than a battle's end. It marked the turning of an age. But the question remains, what if Sobieski had failed? What if the cavalry had not charged? Or the alliance had collapsed under its own suspicions? Would the crescent have risen over the cathedrals of Rome? Would Paris, Vienna, or even London carry a different face today? We will never know, because 80,000 men chose to act when everything in the world told them not to. And yet what they fought for, courage, unity, sacrifice, is fragile. It does not survive on its own. If we stop telling these stories, if we stop remembering, then the lesson of Vienna is lost. Silence finishes what the Ottomans could not. And if you let that happen, then in a way, Sobieski charged for nothing. Next we uncover another clash, where arrogance doomed an empire, the Roman disaster at Cannae, a battle where pride blinded generals and one man's genius rewrote the fate of legions. So before you leave, remember this: if you walk away without subscribing, these forgotten truths vanish again into silence. Don't be the reason history is erased. Be the reason it survives.